The afternoon of July 15, 1943, found Rear Admiral Takeo Kurita standing on the bridge wing of the heavy cruiser Kumano, his flagship anchored in Truk Lagoon. The sprawling atoll in the Caroline Islands served as the Imperial Japanese Navy's primary forward base, a fortress of coral and steel from which Japan's combined fleet projected power across the South Pacific. Kurita was reviewing intelligence summaries when a staff officer approached with a folder marked urgent. Inside were reconnaissance photographs and reports compiled by Japanese naval intelligence over the previous 6 months. The Admiral studied the documents in silence, his expression unchanging, but his grip on the papers tightened perceptibly. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The photographs showed American shipyards, 11 of them. And in those shipyards, stretched across the continental United States from Maine to California, was evidence of something that fundamentally altered Kurita's understanding of the war. Destroyers. Dozens of them, all of the same class, all in various stages of construction, and all being built simultaneously at a pace that seemed to defy the laws of industrial production. Federal Shipbuilding in Kearney, New Jersey showed 4 destroyers under construction. Bath Iron Works in Maine had 7. Consolidated Steel in Orange, Texas was building 8 more, the pattern repeated across every yard. What made Kurita's blood run cold wasn't just the numbers, it was the timeline. According to intelligence estimates, the Americans were completing these destroyers at an average rate of more than 5 ships per month. 5 destroyers. Every 30 days, month after month after month. Japan's entire pre-war destroyer construction program had averaged 8 ships per year. The Americans were building that many in 6 weeks. Had spent 25 years in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He'd commanded destroyers, cruisers, and now led major fleet operations. He understood naval construction, shipyard capacity, and the industrial requirements for building warships. What he was looking at shouldn't have been possible, yet there it was, documented in reconnaissance photographs that couldn't be disputed. The ships were designated Fletcher-class destroyers, named after Admiral Frank Friday Fletcher, a Medal of Honor recipient from the Spanish-American War. At 2,050 tons standard displacement, they were substantial vessels, comparable to Japan's own Fubuki-class destroyers, that had been considered revolutionary when they entered service in 1928. The Americans were mass-producing ships of this quality. Japan had built the Fubuki class slowly, carefully, over 5 years, 24 ships total. The Americans had already commissioned more than 60 Fletchers in just over a year and showed no signs of slowing down. Kurita passed the folder to his chief of staff, Captain Otani Tonosuke, who'd served with him since the Java Sea campaign. Otani scanned the documents, his face paling as he absorbed the implications. "How is this possible, Admiral?" Otani asked quietly. "Our intelligence must be mistaken about the construction rate." Kurita shook his head. "Cross-reference these reports with the American destroyer sightings our submarines have reported. Count the hull numbers. The intelligence is accurate." Otani did the math silently, then looked up. "If they maintain this pace, they will have more destroyers than we possessed at the start of the war," Kurita finished. "Within 18 months, perhaps sooner." The implications hung in the humid tropical air like a death sentence. Every admiral in the combined fleet understood Japan's strategic situation. The war plan had always relied on achieving decisive early victories that would convince the Americans to negotiate a favorable peace. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself had warned before Pearl Harbor that Japan could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year, but could never win a protracted war against American industrial capacity. Now, 19 months into the conflict, that industrial capacity was revealing itself in ways that exceeded even Yamamoto's pessimistic estimates. The Fletcher-class destroyer represented more than just naval construction. It was a statement of industrial philosophy. Where Japan had approached destroyer design as an art form, pushing the boundaries of engineering to create ships that were individually superior, the Americans had approached it as a manufacturing problem. They'd designed a ship that was good enough, then figured out how to build it everywhere, simultaneously, at a pace that turned quantity into its own form of quality. The genesis of the Fletcher-class began in 1939, when the United States Navy sought to break free from the constraints of the London Naval Treaty. That treaty, signed in 1930, had limited destroyer displacement to 1,500 tons, forcing designers to make agonizing compromises between firepower, protection, and endurance. When the treaty system collapsed in 1937, American naval architects finally had the freedom to design the destroyer they'd always wanted. The specifications were straightforward: 2,100 tons, 5 5-inch dual-purpose guns in single mounts, 10 21-inch torpedo tubes in 2 quintuple centerline mounts, speed of at least 35 knots, range sufficient for Pacific operations, approximately 6,000 nautical miles at 15 knots, and critically, a design that could be built quickly by multiple shipyards, including yards with limited experience constructing warships. That last requirement was the key. Pre-war American destroyer construction had been concentrated in a handful of specialized naval shipyards. Bath, Iron Works, Federal Shipbuilding, and a few others had the expertise and equipment to build complex warships. But in wartime, the Navy would need dozens of destroyers, then hundreds. That meant bringing new yards online, yards that built merchant ships or had never built ships at all. The Fletcher design prioritized buildability. The hull was a simple flush deck configuration without the complex forecastle brakes that characterized earlier American destroyers. Structural components were designed for prefabrication, allowing sections to be built in separate workshops, then assembled on the ways. The machinery plant used standard components that multiple manufacturers could supply. Even the armament reflected pragmatic thinking, with 5 single gun mounts being simpler to install than the twin mounts used on later designs. When the first Fletcher-class keel was laid at the Federal Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in Kearney, New Jersey on October 4, 1941, America wasn't yet at war. But the Two-Ocean Navy Act of 1940 and subsequent authorizations had already approved orders for 175 Fletchers spread across 11 shipyards. The program was explicitly designed as an emergency expansion, recognizing that war was coming and the Navy would need every destroyer it could build. The USS Fletcher herself, hull number DD-445, was launched on May 3, 1942, almost exactly 7 months after her keel was laid. She was commissioned on June 30, 1942, just under 9 months from start to finish. That timeline was respectable by any standard, comparable to Japanese construction rates. What was extraordinary was that 10 other shipyards were building identical sisters simultaneously. Bath Iron Works in Bath, Maine became the second largest Fletcher producer. The yard had been building destroyers since World War I and knew the business intimately. They tooled up quickly, creating assembly line processes that allowed them to have multiple Fletchers under construction at any given time. By mid-1943, Bath was launching a new Fletcher roughly every 3 weeks: Charleston Naval Shipyard in South Carolina, Boston Navy Yard in Massachusetts, Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Washington, Consolidated Steel Corporation in Orange, Texas, Gulf Shipbuilding in Chickasaw, Alabama, Seattle-Tacoma Shipbuilding in Washington, Bethlehem Steel in San Francisco, Bethlehem Steel in Staten Island, and Bethlehem Steel in San Pedro, California, all joined the program. Each yard developed its own optimization techniques while adhering to the standard Fletcher design. The Americans had learned from Henry Kaiser's revolutionary Liberty ship program, which was simultaneously producing merchant vessels at an unprecedented rate. Kaiser's yards had proven that traditional shipbuilding craft could be transformed into industrial manufacturing through careful planning, prefabrication, and efficient workflow. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Fletcher program adopted these principles wholesale. Structural steel was cut and shaped in workshops far from the building ways. Entire deck sections arrived pre-assembled. Engine room components were tested and installed as complete units. Electrical systems were wired and tested in sections before installation. What had once required skilled craftsmen working from blueprints became an assembly process that allowed less experienced workers to contribute meaningfully. The workforce itself was revolutionary. As millions of American men enlisted or were drafted into military service, women entered shipyards in unprecedented numbers. Welders, riveters, electricians, pipefitters, jobs that had been exclusively male domains now included women who proved equally capable. The famous Rosie the Riveter wasn't propaganda. She was real, and she was building destroyers. Raw materials flowed from the American heartland, steel from Pittsburgh, turbines from General Electric, propellers from specialized manufacturers, guns from naval arsenals. The logistics network that supported Fletcher construction represented an industrial ecosystem that Japan couldn't match. American steel production in 1943 exceeded 48 million tons. Japanese production that same year was 7.5 million tons. That 6-to-1 advantage cascaded through every aspect of warship construction. The standard Fletcher construction timeline stabilized at approximately 364 days from keel laying to commissioning, 7 months to launch, 5 more months to complete fitting out, trials, and crew training. Some yards beat this average significantly. Consolidated Steel in Orange, Texas, developed techniques that reduced their timeline to as little as 10 months total, though maintaining quality control at that pace proved challenging. What made the Fletcher program devastating from a strategic perspective wasn't just the speed of individual ships, it was the sustained volume. In 1942, the Navy commissioned 7 Fletchers. In 1943, they commissioned 96. In 1944, they commissioned 67 more. The remaining 5 trickled in during early 1945, before production shifted to improved designs. By mid-1943, when Admiral Kurita was reviewing those intelligence photographs in Truk Lagoon, American shipyards had approximately 110 Fletcher-class destroyers either completed, fitting out, or under construction. Japan's entire destroyer fleet at that moment numbered 148 ships of all classes, and that total was declining monthly, as combat losses exceeded new construction. Japanese destroyer production during the war followed a different path. The pre-war Fubuki, Akatsuki, and Hatsuharu classes had been technological marvels, featuring innovations like enclosed turrets for main battery guns and sophisticated torpedo systems. The subsequent Shiratsuyu, Asashio, Kagero, and Yugumo classes continued this evolution, each iteration seeking incremental improvements in capability, but this approach created problems. Each class required new tooling, new training, new spare parts inventories. Standardization was minimal. A destroyer captain transferring from a Kagero-class ship to a Yugumo class would find different equipment arrangements, different operating procedures, different capabilities. This diversity was elegant from an engineering perspective, but nightmarish for fleet operations and logistics. Japanese destroyer production rates reflected these complexities. The combined fleet commissioned approximately 60 destroyers between Pearl Harbor and mid-1943. Some were pre-war ships completing construction. Others were wartime emergency types designed for faster building. But even the simplified wartime designs, the Akizuki-class fleet anti-aircraft, destroyers, and the smaller Matsu and Tachibana classes couldn't match American production rates. Worse, Japanese losses were accelerating. The Guadalcanal campaign, which had raged from August 1942 through February 1943, had consumed Japanese destroyers at an appalling rate. 40 destroyers participated in the campaign at various times. 16 were sunk. The so-called Tokyo Express runs, where Japanese destroyers made high-speed night runs down the slot to reinforce and resupply Guadalcanal, became death traps as American air power and surface forces learned to intercept them. Each sunk destroyer represented more than just a ship. It represented the crew, the training, the institutional knowledge. Japan had started the war with arguably the most skilled destroyer crews in the world, veterans of night combat operations refined during the China War. Those crews were dying faster than they could be replaced, and the new crews lacked the experience that had made the pre-war destroyer force so formidable. The mathematics were brutal. Japan was losing destroyers faster than it could build them. America was building destroyers faster than Japan could sink them. This wasn't a situation that would resolve in Japan's favor through tactical brilliance or operational daring. It was industrial attrition, and the United States held every advantage. Captain Otani set the intelligence folder down on the chart table. "Should we inform the Admiral?" he asked, meaning Admiral Minachi Koga, who'd assumed command of the combined fleet after Yamamoto's death in April. Kurita considered this. Koga already knew the strategic situation. Every senior officer in the combined fleet understood that time was not Japan's ally, but seeing the specifics, understanding just how fast the American destroyer fleet was growing, might provoke a reaction Kurita couldn't predict. Koga was not Yamamoto. He lacked his predecessor's nuanced strategic thinking and tended toward more aggressive operational concepts. "Prepare a summary for fleet headquarters," Kurita finally ordered. "Include the construction rate analysis and projected American destroyer strength by the end of the year. They need to understand what we're facing." The reality was stark. By December 31, 1943, if American production maintained its current pace, the United States Navy would operate more modern destroyers than existed in the entire Imperial Japanese Navy, and 1944 would see the gap widen further. The Fletcher-class wasn't just winning the Pacific War, it was drowning Japan in steel and explosives, one destroyer at a time, faster than any military in history had ever produced comparable warships. For officers like Kurita, who understood industrial capacity and resource competition, the intelligence photographs were more decisive than any battle report could ever be. They showed with absolute clarity that Japan had already lost the pruned war. The fighting would continue. The Fletcher-class destroyer measured 376 feet, 6 inches in overall length. Beam was 39 feet, 6 inches. Draft at full load was 17 feet, 9 inches. These dimensions made the Fletcher substantially larger than the Benson and Gleaves-class destroyers that preceded it, but the real revolution was in what those dimensions contained. The machinery plant consisted of 4 Babcock and Wilcox boilers feeding 2 sets of General Electric geared turbines, generating 60,000 shaft horsepower and driving 2 propellers. This arrangement gave the Fletcher a design speed of 38 knots, though many ships exceeded 40 knots during sea trials. More importantly, the machinery was reliable, maintainable, and could operate continuously for extended periods without major maintenance. Japanese destroyer machinery, while technically sophisticated, required more frequent maintenance and was less forgiving of damage. A Fletcher could take a torpedo hit in one boiler room, isolate the damage, and continue operating on the remaining boilers at reduced speed. Japanese destroyers with similar damage often became uncontrollable or sank outright due to progressive flooding and loss of power. The main battery of 5 5-inch 38 caliber guns represented a careful balance. The Mark 12 5-inch gun was a dual-purpose weapon, equally effective against surface targets and aircraft. Rate of fire was 15 to 20 rounds per minute per gun, meaning a Fletcher could put 75 to 100 5-inch shells into the air every minute when all guns were engaged. Each gun mount was positioned to provide optimal firing arcs, 2 forward, 2 aft, and 1 amidships between the funnels. This arrangement meant a Fletcher could bring 3 guns to bear directly ahead, 3 directly astern, and all 5 in broadside engagements. The fire control system, consisting of the Mark 37 director with Mark 4 radar, allowed accurate gunnery at ranges exceeding 10 miles in surface action and against aircraft at altitudes up to 30,000 feet. Torpedo armament consisted of 10 21-inch tubes in 2 quintuple mounts positioned on the center line. The Mark 15 torpedo carried a 660-pound warhead and had a range of 6,000 yards at 46 knots or 15,000 yards at 26 knots. While not as capable as the Japanese Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, which had longer range and larger warhead, the Mark 15 was reliable and deadly in the close-range night actions that characterized Pacific destroyer combat. Anti-submarine warfare capability was built in from the design stage: 6 K-gun depth charge throwers, 3 per side, supplemented 2 stern-mounted depth charge racks. A Fletcher carried up to 56 depth charges and could lay devastating patterns against submerged submarines. The sonar system, increasingly sophisticated as the war progressed, made Fletchers formidable submarine hunters. They accounted for 29 confirmed Japanese submarine kills during the war. But statistics and specifications only told part of the story. What made the Fletcher truly revolutionary was how quickly American shipyards learned to build them efficiently. Federal Shipbuilding in Kearney pioneered prefabrication techniques that others copied. The hull was divided into sections, each built separately in workshops away from the building ways. These sections, some weighing over 50 tons, were assembled using massive cranes that had been installed specifically for the destroyer program. What had traditionally been a linear construction process became parallel, with multiple sections advancing simultaneously. Welding replaced riveting wherever possible. Riveted construction was stronger in some applications, but welding was faster and required less skilled labor. As American welders gained experience, quality improved dramatically. By mid-1943, welded seams on Fletchers were as strong as riveted joints and took a fraction of the time to complete. The workforce grew with the program. Federal Shipbuilding employed approximately 8,000 workers in 1941. By 1943, that number exceeded 20,000. Similar expansion occurred at every Fletcher-producing yard. These weren't all experienced shipbuilders. Many had never seen a warship before Pearl Harbor. They were farmers, factory workers, teachers, housewives, ordinary Americans transformed into industrial warriors through training programs that compressed years of apprenticeship into months of intensive instruction. Bath Iron Works in Maine became legendary for its efficiency. The yard's workers took pride in beating construction schedules, competing with other yards for the fastest build times. Management fostered this competitive spirit while maintaining quality control that was obsessive even by naval standards. A Bath-built Fletcher was considered the gold standard, though every yard produced ships that met Navy specifications. The human cost of this production tempo was substantial. Shipyard work was dangerous. Heavy equipment, molten metal, confined spaces, working at heights accidents were inevitable. Between 1942 and 1945, more than 6,000 shipyard workers died in industrial accidents across all American yards. Thousands more were injured. The Fletcher program accounted for its share of this toll, yet the work continued. Workers understood what was at stake. Japanese intelligence officers compiling reports on American destroyer production struggled to make their superiors understand the implications. The numbers seemed impossible. How could American shipyards launch a destroyer every 5 days? The photographs were there, the hull numbers were recorded. But accepting the reality meant accepting that Japan faced an opponent whose industrial capacity exceeded anything in human history. Some Japanese planners tried to find comfort in quality arguments. Perhaps American destroyers were inferior to Japanese ships, built quickly but poorly. This hope died when Fletchers began appearing in combat. They fought well. They survived damage that would have sunk lesser ships. They operated reliably in conditions that would have overwhelmed poorly built vessels. The Americans had achieved something remarkable: mass production without quality compromise. Admiral Kurita understood this because he'd studied American industry before the war. He'd visited the United States in 1936 as part of a naval exchange program, touring industrial facilities in Pittsburgh and Detroit. He'd seen the automobile assembly lines that produced thousands of cars per day. He'd watched steel mills that never stopped running, continuous production that seemed to mock traditional craft manufacturing. At the time, he'd been impressed, but not alarmed. Automobiles and consumer goods were different from warships. The precision required for naval construction, the specialized knowledge, the complex systems. These couldn't be mass-produced like Fords and Chevrolets. Or so he'd thought. The Fletcher program proved him wrong. The Americans had applied automobile industry principles to warship construction, and it worked. Standardization, interchangeable parts, assembly line processes, quality control through inspection rather than craft expertise. Every Fletcher was identical, meaning any Fletcher sailor could transfer to any other Fletcher and find everything exactly where he expected. Every Fletcher captain knew precisely what his ship could and couldn't do, because every Fletcher had the same capabilities. This standardization extended to maintenance and logistics. A Fletcher operating in the South Pacific used the same spare parts as a Fletcher operating near the Aleutians. Replacement components could be manufactured anywhere and shipped anywhere, assured they would fit. When a Fletcher's fire control radar malfunctioned, the repair crew didn't need to fabricate custom solutions. They pulled the faulty unit, installed a replacement, and the ship was back in action. Japanese destroyers, with their diverse classes and constant modifications, created logistics nightmares. A Fubuki-class destroyer couldn't use spare parts from a Kagero-class destroyer. Each class required its own inventory of specialized components, its own trained technicians, its own documentation. This diversity, born from pursuing incremental performance improvements, made Japanese destroyer operations increasingly difficult as the war progressed and supply lines deteriorated. The strategic implications cascaded through every level of naval operations. American destroyer squadrons could be deployed anywhere, confident that maintenance support would be available. Japanese destroyer divisions had to be carefully tracked to ensure they operated near bases that could support their specific classes. When a Japanese destroyer suffered battle damage, repairs often took months because specialized components had to be manufactured. Similar damage to a Fletcher was repaired in weeks because replacement parts were already in the supply system. By late 1943, the American destroyer advantage was becoming apparent in combat results. The Battle of Vella La Vella on October 6, 1943, saw 3 Fletcher-class destroyers engage 3 Japanese destroyers and a flotilla leader. The Americans sank 1 Japanese destroyer, damaged 2 others, and withdrew with minor damage to 1 Fletcher. The action lasted 45 minutes and demonstrated that American destroyers, even when slightly outnumbered, could hold their own against the vaunted Japanese destroyer force. The Battle of Empress Augusta Bay on November 2, 1943, reinforced this reality. 4 American light cruisers and 8 destroyers, including 4 Fletchers, engaged 4 Japanese heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 6 destroyers. The Japanese had numerical superiority in heavy units, but the American force, better coordinated and equipped with superior radar, inflicted devastating losses. 1 Japanese light cruiser was sunk, 2 heavy cruisers, and 2 destroyers were severely damaged. The Americans suffered only minor damage to several ships. These engagements weren't flukes. They represented the culmination of American tactical development, superior technology, and the confidence that came from knowing reinforcements were always available. Every Japanese ship sunk was irreplaceable. Every American ship damaged could be repaired quickly or replaced by new construction. This psychological advantage was as important as any technological edge. Admiral Kurita forwarded his analysis to Combined Fleet Headquarters in November 1943. The response came 3 weeks later. Fleet Headquarters acknowledged the American production advantage, but emphasized that Japanese destroyer crews remained superior in night combat tactics. Training and fighting spirit would compensate for numerical disadvantage. It was the response Kurita expected, and it was completely inadequate to the reality they faced. The truth was that Japanese destroyer crews, while still skilled, were being eroded by constant combat. The veteran petty officers and experienced officers who'd made the pre-war destroyer force so formidable were dying in the Solomons, in New Guinea, in 100 small actions across the Pacific. Their replacements, rushed through abbreviated training programs, lacked the polish and precision that had characterized Japanese destroyer operations in 1942. American crews were improving through the opposite trajectory. Every month brought more experienced officers and sailors. The peacetime Navy's small size had meant limited sea time for most personnel, but 2 years of war had created a generation of sailors who knew their ships intimately and had developed the tactical instincts that only combat could teach. Fletcher crews trained constantly. The American training system, while initially overwhelmed by wartime expansion, had developed efficient methods for producing competent sailors quickly. Gunnery drills, damage control exercises, tactical maneuvering. Fletcher crews practiced obsessively, and the practice showed in combat. Hit rates with the 5-inch guns improved steadily throughout 1943. Torpedo attacks became more effective. Damage control teams learned to save ships that would have been lost in earlier engagements. The material advantage amplified the human advantage. A Fletcher's radar could detect enemy ships at ranges where Japanese destroyers were still searching visually. This meant American destroyers knew enemy position, course, and speed, while remaining undetected themselves. They could maneuver into optimal firing positions, launch torpedo attacks from unexpected angles, and concentrate gunfire effectively from the first salvo. Japanese destroyers, lacking comparable radar, relied on superior optics and the legendary night vision of their lookouts. These tools had served them well in early war engagements, but they couldn't compete with electronics. A lookout might spot an enemy ship at 6,000 yards on a clear night. Radar detected ships at 20,000 yards in fog, rain, or total darkness. The advantage was insurmountable. Some Japanese destroyers received primitive radar sets as the war progressed, but these were crude compared to American systems and often malfunctioned. Japan's electronics industry, while capable of producing quality equipment in small quantities, couldn't match American mass production of reliable radar sets. By late 1943, virtually every Fletcher in service had been fitted with surface search radar, fire control radar, and air search radar. The Americans were fighting a different war, one where information dominance was as important as firepower. The cumulative effect of American destroyer production was strategic paralysis for Japan. The combined fleet couldn't commit destroyers to decisive fleet actions because the destroyer force was needed for convoy escort, troop transport, and defensive operations. But defensive operations consumed destroyers steadily through attrition, air attacks, submarine attacks, and the occasional surface engagement. Japanese planners faced an impossible equation. They needed to concentrate forces for decisive battle, but dispersed operations were bleeding them dry. Yet concentration risked catastrophic loss in a single engagement, as had happened at Midway and would happen again at Philippine Sea. The Americans, by contrast, could afford to lose ships. They were building them faster than Japan could sink them. By December 31, 1943, the United States Navy had commissioned 110 Fletcher-class destroyers. Another 65 were under construction or fitting out. The Japanese destroyer force numbered 128 ships of all classes, down from 176 at Pearl Harbor. The crossover point was approaching. Within 6 months, the American destroyer force would be numerically superior. Within a year, it would be overwhelming. Admiral Kurita knew this. Most senior Japanese officers knew this, but knowing and accepting were different things. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been built on the presumption of qualitative superiority compensating for numerical disadvantage. That doctrine had worked in the Russo-Japanese War, where superior Japanese training and tactics had defeated a larger Russian fleet at Tsushima. It had worked in the early stages of the Pacific War, when veteran Japanese units had destroyed poorly coordinated Allied forces. But it couldn't work against an opponent that matched you in quality, while exceeding you in quantity by a growing margin. The Americans weren't just building more destroyers. They were building better sailors to crew them, developing better tactics to employ them, and creating a logistics system that kept them operational. This was industrial warfare at a scale that rendered traditional naval calculations obsolete. The Fletcher-class destroyer became the physical manifestation of American industrial power. Each ship represented 3,500 tons of steel, countless hours of skilled labor, sophisticated electronics, precision machinery, and complex weapons systems. and the Americans were producing them at a rate of more than one per week, week after week, month after month, with no indication they would stop until Japan surrendered or was destroyed. For officers like Admiral Kurita, watching this production juggernaut from the other side, the experience was profoundly demoralizing. You could win every tactical engagement, sink more enemy ships than you lost, employ superior tactics and demonstrate better seamanship, and still lose because the enemy replaced his losses while yours were permanent. This was the lesson the Fletcher-class taught. Industrial capacity, properly mobilized and efficiently employed, was more decisive than valor or skill. The Americans had learned to build destroyers the way they built everything else, quickly, efficiently, and in overwhelming quantities. And having learned this lesson, they were applying it to carriers, battleships, cruisers, submarines, aircraft, tanks, trucks, and every other instrument of modern warfare. Japan had awakened something it couldn't put back to sleep. The sleeping giant was not just awake, it was building weapons faster than any nation in history, and those weapons were drowning Japan in steel. The Fletcher-class destroyer wasn't just a ship, it was a statement. It said, in the clearest possible terms, America's industrial might was unlimited, its will was unbreakable, and its victory was inevitable. The strategic reality that Admiral Kurita had identified in July 1943 manifested with brutal clarity over the following 2 years. The Fletcher-class destroyer force, growing exponentially, became the backbone of every major American naval operation in the Pacific. They screened carriers, conducted anti-submarine patrols, bombarded invasion beaches, fought surface actions, and performed the 1,000 unglamorous tasks that modern naval warfare demanded. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 demonstrated the Fletcher's combat effectiveness on the largest possible stage. This 4-day naval engagement, the largest in history, saw Admiral Kurita commanding center force in a desperate attempt to destroy American amphibious forces landing on Leyte. His force included the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, 5 other battleships, 12 cruisers, and 13 destroyers. Opposing him were multiple American task forces, including dozens of Fletcher-class destroyers. During the Battle off Samar on October 25, 2 Fletchers, USS Johnston and USS Hoel, were part of a tiny American force that included 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts facing Kurita's massive fleet. The destroyers attacked without hesitation, pressing torpedo runs against battleships and cruisers at suicidal ranges. Johnston, commanded by Commander Ernest Evans, closed to within 10,000 yards of the battleship Congo before launching torpedoes, then engaged heavy cruisers with gunfire while maneuvering through shell splashes from 14-inch battleship guns. The destroyer absorbed dozens of hits from 8-inch and 5-inch shells before finally sinking, but not before helping convince Kurita that he faced a much larger force than actually existed. Hoel, commanded by Commander Leon Kintberger, made similar attacks, pressing so close to Japanese heavy cruisers that their 8-inch guns couldn't depress far enough to hit her. Both ships were lost, along with the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, but their sacrifice helped turn back Kurita's force and saved the amphibious fleet. The action demonstrated that Fletcher-class destroyers, properly handled, could threaten even the most powerful surface units. But individual heroism, while inspiring, wasn't what won campaigns. Numbers did. Mass did. During the Leyte Gulf operation, the United States Navy deployed over 100 destroyers of all classes, with Fletchers comprising the majority. They were everywhere screening carriers during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, conducting anti-submarine patrols in Surigao Strait, providing gunfire support for the landings, hunting Japanese submarines attempting to infiltrate the transport areas. Japanese forces at Leyte could achieve local superiority in specific engagements, but they couldn't achieve theater-wide superiority because they were simply outnumbered. Every concentration of Japanese forces for an attack meant other areas were left undefended. The Americans, by contrast, could concentrate overwhelming force at the decisive point while maintaining adequate strength everywhere else. The mathematics were inexorable. By October 1944, the United States Navy operated 143 commissioned Fletcher-class destroyers. Another 26 were completing trials or fitting out. 6 more would commission before February 1945, bringing the total to 175 ships. In 32 months, 11 shipyards had produced more destroyers than the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed at the start of the war. Meanwhile, Japan's destroyer force continued its steady erosion. The Battle of Leyte Gulf cost Japan 4 destroyers sunk. The Philippines campaign that followed consumed more. By January 1945, the combined fleet's destroyer strength had fallen to fewer than 60 ships, many damaged, all suffering from inadequate maintenance and dwindling fuel supplies. The Okinawa campaign, beginning in April 1945, showcased the Fletcher's final evolution. By this stage of the war, kamikazes had become Japan's primary naval weapon, and destroyers were assigned the dangerous duty of radar picket stations around the invasion fleet. These picket destroyers positioned themselves miles from the main body, serving as early warning sentinels and sacrificial targets that absorbed kamikaze attacks before they could reach the carriers and transports. 15 Fletchers were lost at Okinawa, more than at any other operation. USS Luce was sunk by kamikaze on May 4th. USS Little went down the same day, USS Morrison on May 4th, USS Drexler on May 28th. They died providing the radar coverage that allowed fleet air defense to function, and their sacrifice saved countless other ships. Even in death, they were fulfilling their designed purpose, taking damage so more valuable ships survived. But for every Fletcher lost at Okinawa, 2 more arrived from Pearl Harbor, San Diego, or the East Coast. The replacements were crewed by sailors who'd trained on earlier Fletchers transferred to training duty, so institutional knowledge was preserved. Japanese kamikaze pilots, by contrast, were dying on their first missions, taking their training with them. This asymmetry in learning curves favored the Americans overwhelmingly. Japanese naval planners by early 1945 had abandoned any pretense that they could contest American naval supremacy. The combined fleet, as a fighting force, effectively ceased to exist after Leyte Gulf. The super battleship Yamato's suicidal sortie to Okinawa in April 1945 was explicitly planned as a one-way mission because Japan lacked the fuel for a round trip and lacked the destroyer escorts to provide adequate screening. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, commanding the Yamato force, protested the operation as wasteful and futile. He was overruled by superiors who valued symbolic gestures over strategic sense. Yamato sailed with the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, none of them Fletcher's equals in combat capability by this stage. American submarines detected the force immediately. American carrier aircraft attacked on April 7th with over 350 aircraft. Yamato absorbed at least 11 torpedoes and 6 bombs before capsizing. Yahagi was sunk. 4 destroyers went down. The surviving destroyers rescued survivors and limped back to Japan, accomplishing nothing except adding to the casualty lists. The operation demonstrated with painful clarity that Japan no longer possessed a functioning navy. The industrial imbalance had progressed from disadvantage to catastrophe. The question that haunted Japanese admirals throughout 1945 was how they'd failed to anticipate this outcome. The famous sleeping giant quote attributed to Admiral Yamamoto, whether he actually said it or not, captured a truth that Japanese leadership had intellectually understood but emotionally refused to accept. America's industrial capacity was theoretically known. Every Japanese officer who'd studied at the Naval War College had reviewed the statistics on American steel production, shipyard capacity, and manufacturing capability. But knowing statistics and witnessing their practical application were different experiences. The Fletcher-class program demonstrated American industrial capacity in a form that couldn't be rationalized away. 175 destroyers in 32 months wasn't a statistic. It was reality manifested in steel, appearing in combat zones across the Pacific, replacing losses faster than they occurred, enabling operations that would have been impossible with a smaller destroyer force. Admiral Kurita survived the war. He spent the final months serving in increasingly meaningless staff positions as the combined fleet disintegrated and Japan's home islands came under direct attack. In post-war interviews, he spoke carefully about strategic decisions and operational considerations. but he consistently returned to the industrial disparity as the fundamental cause of Japan's defeat. "We knew America was powerful," he said in a 1952 interview with naval historians. "We knew they could build more ships than we could, but understanding that intellectually and seeing it happen are different things." When I looked at those reconnaissance photographs in 1943, I knew we had lost. Not that we would lose, that we had already lost. The war would continue for 2 more years, but the outcome was decided by American shipyards, not by battles. This assessment was shared by other surviving Japanese naval officers. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, who served as Chief of Staff of Combined Fleet, wrote in his memoir, "The American ability to replace losses made conventional attrition strategy impossible. We could sink their ships, but they built them faster than we could destroy them." Meanwhile, every Japanese ship lost was irreplaceable. This arithmetic had only one possible conclusion. The Fletcher-class destroyers' post-war service validated the design's excellence. Unlike earlier American destroyers that were quickly scrapped or relegated to reserve status, Fletchers remained frontline units well into the Cold War. Many received modernization programs that added new electronics, replaced anti-aircraft guns with more modern weapons, and upgraded fire control systems. During the Korean War from 1950 to 53, Fletcher-class destroyers provided gunfire support for ground operations, conducted anti-submarine patrols, and screened carriers. Some remained in active service with the United States Navy until 1971, an extraordinary career spanning nearly 30 years. The last Fletcher-class destroyer in American service, USS Caperton, was decommissioned on November 1, 1973. But the Fletcher's service didn't end with American decommissioning. Under the Military Assistance Program, dozens of Fletchers were transferred to Allied navies. Greece, Italy, West Germany, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Turkey, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Peru, Brazil, and Mexico all operated Fletcher-class destroyers. These ships served into the 1980s and 90s, with Mexico's arm Cuitlahuac, the former USS John Rodgers, not retiring until July 2001, 59 years after the first Fletcher was commissioned. This longevity testified to the design's fundamental soundness. A warship built for World War II remained effective enough for late 20th century operations, albeit with extensive modifications. The hull form was seaworthy in all conditions. The machinery was reliable and maintainable. The basic design was flexible enough to accommodate new weapons and electronics without requiring complete reconstruction. 4. Fletcher-class destroyers survive as museum ships. USS Kidd in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, is preserved in late World War II configuration and is considered the most authentic Fletcher display anywhere. USS The Sullivans in Buffalo, New York, named for 5 brothers who died together when their light cruiser was sunk at Guadalcanal, serves as a memorial. USS Cassin Young in Boston commemorates a Medal of Honor recipient, and HS Velos in Greece, the former USS Charette, remains technically commissioned in the Hellenic Navy while serving as a museum. These museum ships allow modern visitors to experience what Fletcher crews lived daily: the cramped quarters, the maze of passageways, the complexity of the machinery spaces, the claustrophobic feeling of a warship designed for function rather than comfort. Walking through a Fletcher-class destroyer provides visceral understanding of what mass production meant in human terms. These were fighting machines, built quickly and efficiently, designed to do a job rather than provide luxury. The strategic lesson of the Fletcher-class program extended far beyond naval warfare. It demonstrated that industrial mobilization, when properly executed, could be decisive in modern war. The Soviet Union applied similar principles to tank production, ultimately building over 55,034 tanks that overwhelmed German armor through sheer numbers. Germany attempted similar programs but started too late and lacked sufficient resources. Britain's Spitfire production sustained the RAF through the Battle of Britain and beyond, but America's destroyer program remained the exemplar because it combined quality with quantity in ways no other nation managed. The Fletchers weren't cheap emergency designs built to minimal standards. They were capable warships, individually competitive with anything Japan built, but manufactured at a pace that transformed quantity into strategic advantage. The doctrinal implications influenced post-war naval thinking profoundly. The United States Navy's Cold War force structure assumed that mass production capability was as important as individual ship quality. Standardized designs that could be built by multiple shipyards became the norm. The Knox-class frigates, Oliver Hazard-Perry-class frigates, and Spruance-class destroyers of later decades all reflected lessons learned from the Fletcher program: build a good enough design, then build lots of them. The Fletcher-class destroyer force peaked at 175 ships in February 1945. At that moment, the United States Navy operated more destroyers of a single class than most nations operated total warships. This force enabled the final campaigns of the Pacific War: the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the blockade of Japan's home islands. Without the Fletchers, these operations would have been impossible or prohibitively costly. When Japanese representatives signed the surrender documents on September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, dozens of American destroyers lay at anchor in the harbor. Many were Fletchers. They'd fought from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, from the Aleutians to the Philippines, in every major engagement and countless minor actions. They'd lost sisters to kamikazes, torpedoes, and shore batteries, but they'd never lost a campaign. For the Japanese admirals attending the surrender ceremony, seeing those destroyers arrayed in Tokyo Bay was a final, undeniable confirmation of the industrial disparity that had doomed their nation. Admiral Kurita was not present. He'd been relieved of command after Leyte Gulf and spent the war's final months in administrative duties. But had he been there, he would have recognized the inevitable conclusion to the intelligence report he'd studied in July 1943. The Fletcher-class destroyer represented more than superior shipbuilding. It represented a different approach to warfare, one that treated industrial capacity as a weapon as potent as any gun or torpedo. The Americans didn't just build ships, they built them faster, more efficiently, and in greater numbers than any previous nation in history. And having built them, they used them with a profligacy that only vast production capacity could support. This was the lesson that Japan learned too late and at terrible cost. Industrial warfare rewarded different attributes than traditional warfare. Courage, tactical skill, and fighting spirit mattered, but they couldn't overcome an opponent who could replace losses overnight and reinforce success continuously. The Fletcher program proved that modern war was as much about factories and shipyards as about battles and campaigns. When Admiral Yamamoto allegedly warned about awakening a sleeping giant, he understood perhaps better than his colleagues that America's true strength wasn't its existing navy, but its ability to build a new one. The Fletcher-class destroyer was that navy made manifest. 90 destroyers launched in 6 months during 1943, 175 total in less than 3 years, numbers that seemed impossible until you understood that America's industrial capacity, properly mobilized, had no practical limits. Japan had gambled on a short war because its leadership knew they couldn't win a long one. The gamble failed at Midway, and everything after that was denouement. The Fletcher-class destroyers, appearing in ever-increasing numbers throughout 1943 and 44, were the physical embodiment of that failure. Each ship was a reminder that Japan faced an opponent whose resources were effectively unlimited and whose will to victory was unbreakable. The morning of July 15, 1943, when Admiral Kurita stood on his flagship's bridge reviewing reconnaissance photographs, marked the moment when one Japanese officer fully comprehended what his nation faced. Not the possibility of defeat, defeat was always possible, but the inevitability of it, the certainty that no amount of tactical brilliance or operational success could overcome the industrial tsunami about to crash over the combined fleet. 90 destroyers in 6 months, that was the reality that killed Japanese hopes more surely than any battle. It said, in the clearest possible terms, that America was playing a different game entirely, one where the rules favored whoever could mobilize industrial power most effectively. And in that game, Japan never had a chance. The Fletcher-class destroyer won the Pacific War not through any single engagement or heroic action, but through sheer overwhelming presence. They were everywhere, always, in numbers that made them unavoidable and unstoppable. They turned the Pacific Ocean into an American lake not because individual ships were invincible, but because the fleet was inexhaustible. For the Japanese admirals who'd studied American industry and warned against war, the Fletcher program validated every fear. For the Japanese admirals who'd dismissed those warnings, believing spirit could overcome material disadvantage, the Fletchers were a harsh education in modern warfare's realities. And for the American shipyard workers who built them, the sailors who crewed them, and the nation that produced them, the Fletcher-class destroyer was proof that democracy's industrial might, once awakened, was the most powerful weapon in human history. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.